Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Welcome back to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. Today we're going to be talking about biodiversity. Nature underpins and enables everything we do as an economy and as a society. And biodiversity is what makes nature work. Yet we're losing biodiversity at a really rapid rate. In fact, it's vanishing at such an unprecedented level that it's being described as a sixth mass extinction. And the outcome of the recent Nature COP didn't exactly make a great deal of headway in addressing it. Despite the 2030 targets of protecting land and ocean, 30% of it by 2030, only 12 out of the 17 most biodiverse nations actually hit the October deadline to submit plans for reversing biodiversity loss. So it seems as if governments have yet to integrate biodiversity actions into their public actions. There's also a lot of talk around the recent climate COP and how it's failed to achieve its goals. Yet businesses still have to deal with what's going on. They're beginning to recognise that as nature underpins their supply chains and operations, addressing the climate crisis without addressing biodiversity is simply not going to be good enough. So today we're being joined by Nicole Sherwin, the Chief Impact Officer at sustainability intelligence group EcoVadis, to talk about the critical connection between nature, land and climate. We need to understand what's going on and how companies should navigate this changing environment. So, Nicole, welcome to the show. Could you introduce yourself and EcoVadis and tell us a little bit about exactly what you do?
Yes, thank you, Felicia, so much for having me today. It's an honor to be here. So as Chief Impact Officer of EcoVadis, I am responsible for implementing best-in-class sustainability practices internally within our own organization. But perhaps even more importantly for the magnified impact that we have is to ensure our business strategy is aligned with our company purpose. EcoVadis is a purpose-driven company. This is stated in our corporate bylaws, and our purpose commitment is to guide all companies towards a sustainable world. So how we do this, we're dedicated to embedding sustainability intelligence, essentially business ratings and insights into every business decision worldwide. We're focused on global supply chains, and businesses of all sizes rely on the detailed insights that we provide to comply with ESG regulations, reduce GHG emissions, manage carbon, and just overall to accelerate their own business and their value chains towards resilience, sustainable growth, and positive impact in the world. Today, we work with over 140,000 companies that are using EcoVadis. They're in over 200 countries and as well as industries around the world.
I think the use of the word resilience is really, really interesting because we have all these issues around the backlash to ESG, which is crazy because it's a risk-adjusted investment lens. You know, sustainability, ESG, these are terms which I think for some it's become a bit of a challenge to work out how to integrate them. But to think about resilience, to think about how a company survives what's happening is a really, really interesting approach to take. Now, I think what would be really useful is if you could explain why it matters. What does biodiversity encompass? Why is it crucial for healthy ecosystems? And why do they matter to business and the economy?
That is the question on the table at the center, right? Well, you stated a bit of these facts a bit earlier, but indeed, currently, species extinction rate is estimated between 1,000 to 10,000 times higher than a natural extinction rate. So the rate of species extinctions that might occur if humans were not around. You know, this rate of species population decline and extinction are high enough to therefore threaten important ecological functions that support human life on Earth, such as a stable climate, such as predictable, regional rainfall patterns, such as leading to how well farmland is productive or fisheries. Now, getting to the business side of this, without these healthy ecosystems, our economies potentially could grind to a halt. over half of the world's GDP, so it's about 44 trillion US dollars, is dependent on nature and the services and resources it provides for us. I think we take that for granted, maybe not aware of the interconnectedness of that, so that nature is actually serving us and we are depleting it. And there's a codependency there, both for, sustaining human, but also how to sustain humans through as well the businesses that we rely on in our daily lives.
So, how does biodiversity loss impact in different sectors? Because we often read about problems with pollinators, and that's obviously a huge issue for anyone growing things. But how does it impact business across different sectors? And can you explain what sort of sectors are going to be particularly affected?
Yes. So, in fact, more than 90% of biodiversity loss is driven by the extraction and the processing of natural resources. These are very key inputs. These are the key inputs to our global value chains, right? Of building things, of creating things, of the things we eat, of the things we use every day. We don't often see the original raw material, but it's there going into the global value chain. That being said, there's really two industries that have the heaviest impact on biodiversity loss. Those would be construction and agriculture. We did a survey, in fact, to better understand these two industries' thinking on biodiversity and how the crisis is evolving. So for construction and agriculture, we had around almost 140 responses from companies based in almost 40 countries. One of the things we asked them was which primary drivers of biodiversity loss do their operations contribute to? The results showed, in fact, that climate change is really the leading driver associated with their activities. Followed closely by pollution, I will say as well. It reflects a profound recognition of climate issues, as well as their interconnectedness to biodiversities. They're both highly dependent on climate-related ecosystem services, such as climate regulation or flood and stormwater protection. So compared to other industries, these are really the two. I would say the agricultural industry is more aware and taking a bit more action on understanding the challenges, but also the opportunities posed by biodiversity crisis. There's major risks there that are quite precise on biodiversity loss. So low soil fertility, for example, or water scarcity. This leads directly to lower crop yields and productivity, right? Directly, we can link that to profit and other such business-related topics. One last thing to share on this survey from these two industries of where they're receiving pressure. The two top stakeholders that are putting pressure on action first, 72% government and regulatory bodies. I think we'll talk about regulations, I hope, today. And secondly, followed by clients and consumers, which I think is quite natural and normal, especially in agriculture. It's something we touch, we use every day. We have a choice in that, and we understand that there's interconnection. I think these two pressures will only increase as this crisis accelerates.
And that makes sense and actually is a really neat segue into the regulatory discussion, because I know in the UK we've now got net biodiversity gain for construction. What is actually happening? Because, you talk about stakeholders being clients and consumers are one set, and I understand that. For clients, is it that clients need the information around what companies are doing so they can complete their own regulatory responses? So is it this cascade effect? Is it the regulations as they stand? And actually, what is going on around regulations around biodiversity loss?
Yeah, good question. I think to your first comment on talking about the supply chain and B2B and a B2B relationship, if we just talk about climate change in itself, up to 90% of a company's carbon footprint is actually in the supply chain. So you can imagine similar, and I don't have the exact fact on biodiversity linked to that, but similarly, the value chain is where a lot of the activity is coming. Knowing extraction of raw materials is a key part of the value chain. There's also a significant piece of working on biodiversity actions that are contained in the value chain. And therefore, yes, customers are very tuned in, setting targets, engaging and working to engage their supply chain to take this topic seriously and take action on that. On targets and frameworks and regulations, I'd like to first start out by saying that, CSRD, a regulation like CSRD, for example, or CS3D. These are based on voluntary standards, some of which coming from 50 years ago. So the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct dates back almost 50 years now. Global Reporting Initiative, 30 years. Carbon Disclosure Project, 25 years. So a lot of these frameworks have been existing. So I understand some companies have been surprised by these regulations. Where did it come from? I have to do all these things now. the leaders in this space that understood the interconnection of people, planet, and profit adopted these voluntary frameworks as they were coming up for many, many years now. I think regulation can be said to be a reactive step at the tail end of systemic transformation. So in a way, it's aimed to bring the laggards, if I dare say it in that way, that are tailing behind, to bring them up to recognize and understand, because the voluntary frameworks, they didn't have teeth. They made business sense, but lack of adoption for facing the crisis we face, whether it's climate or biodiversity in this case of this conversation. The last point, it's not just about, a lot of the regulation. It's about reporting, and I need to get figures and find that information, but they're more centered on a due diligence process. So taking the time to be aware of what the risks are in your own operations and your supply chain, what's material, and systematically managing them. So these frameworks are hugely important as a guidepost, I would say, that are driving companies to move beyond what the voluntary ones have inspired companies to do.
And where is the biggest pressure coming from? Because obviously in climate terms, we've got the EU and the various regulations that are now going through, the process of being reviewed through the omnibus, the CS3D, the CSRD, and I think it's the deforestation regulation. So we know that's happening in the EU. Things are coming through which are attempting to address climate and some biodiversity issues. In California, we've got climate reporting requirements that are going to become legal in the next couple of years. We've got the US, probably, I think most people are expecting it to pull out of the climate process. So where are we seeing regulation accelerating around biodiversity specifically? I'm just fascinated by where these issues can have an impact, because it's one thing to say, construction obviously has a huge impact, and obviously agriculture is hugely impacted as well as having an impact. But I'm just thinking, if you're in fashion, is it going to have an impact in terms of your supply chain for cotton? Or, is it going to be leather handbags for the luxury market? Is it food and drink? A retailer's going to be affected. I'm just interested in how we talk about the interconnection between biodiversity and climate, but it's thinking about the interconnection between different sectors and how they interconnect. So I'm interested in learning more about where are surprising places that these impacts might be, and which countries are really taking the lead in pushing that regulation forward.
Yeah. I don't have a magic ball to say what interconnections between different industries might look like and what's going to surface. But I think within the supply chain, that's where we're going to see it. And I think because that's where the interconnections are happening, one influencing the other based on this regulation's pushing me because I'm in this particular industry, or because that's material to me and you're in my supply chain, or it's pushing us both and we both need to act in that area. I believe that the regulation on CSRD and CS3D, so coming out of Europe, that are based on the core principle of due diligence, so an end-to-end process of understanding the risks, taking action on those risks, and then continuing to remediate on those once you find deeper risks, are important. And not that they only cover your own operations. CSRD, if your supply chain is included in that because there's material impacts, it's there. CS3D, much more focused on the supply chain element, including multi-tier transparency. So that's getting into the supplier of the supplier of the supplier's supplier. Quite a complex thing to untangle. Many technology companies, methodologies, approaches have been playing around with that. Conflict Minerals is one, for example, out of the United States that tried, that's pushed companies to be innovative to figure out how to tie back transparency to mining and metals of certain metals. So I think this is the space of a holistic framework. LKSG was one due diligence released out of Germany, which is now a bit being absorbed by CSRD and as CS3D comes. So kind of a consolidation of a framework that goes end to end to require companies to look at what's material to them. Because indeed, in particular certain sectors, design, office management company, for example, biodiversity is not a number one material topic. And that's fair and that's appropriate. For retail, for handbags and those sorts of things, it absolutely is and will be. So acknowledging its material, and then therefore this due diligence process to have controls in place for remediating that and working towards improving it.
And which markets do you see as being most affected? Because I'm thinking actually about the CBAM, where the EU has basically set in place a mechanism where if the carbon price hasn't been included in the market of manufacture, it has to be paid at the borders of the EU to be sold within the EU. Are there markets that you think are particularly at risk from regulation on biodiversity, and that where we might see that kind of action taken for biodiversity and nature?
Yeah, I think one of the risks that has come up, including with this regulation coming out from Europe, and imposing that on the rest of the world, knowing the value chains included, a vast majority of the value chain is in emerging markets, right? Small to medium-sized companies. They don't have the resources as a large organization or multinational company has to invest in certain areas like biodiversity. So there's been a lot of scrutiny around one particular country or region regulation pushing on a global supply chain in emerging markets with a lot of SMEs involved there. I think what will become increasingly important in this context is that it's, to quote, I think it was JFK, but a rising tide raises all boats. I think taking it from that particular perspective, that this regulation pushing, let's say, European companies, therefore, to work with their supply chain, not to stop working if they don't comply, but in a spirit of continuous improvement, the dimension of financing will become very important here. And I think that's something out of recent conversations at COPE on biodiversity that's extraordinarily lacking, and a disappointment from the outcome. The commitments to the financial mechanisms for investing in biodiversity solutions and approaches is way under what the expectation or request was. So that is yet to be seen, because these things need to be financed. Biodiversity services don't exactly have a price tag. There's a lot of innovation happening around how to put a price on different things, water, regenerative agriculture, and so on. I think it's a creative space, but needs to be done mindfully in the approach there.
Okay, so then I'm really interested in what you actually do in order to address this. So how do you actually go about evaluating a company's impact on biodiversity in the sustainability assessments that you do? Do you have specific criteria? Are there specific methodologies and approaches that you favor? How does it work?
Yeah, great question. So our methodology for evaluating companies on sustainability as a whole has been in existence for over 17 years now. It was founded on the basis of some of the voluntary and other frameworks that I mentioned, and has evolved in time with them. And of course, as well with the new regulations, right? The space of sustainability is moving constantly with how it's best practices for companies to manage. So in essence, on the principle, we help benchmark and provide points of guidance on how a company can continue to improve in that space. The methodology is covering a number of different areas: environment, labor, human rights, ethics, and sustainable procurement. It's really on the basis of looking at how a company manages what's material to them. So biodiversity is one of the criteria that's included, and we're looking holistically at how they manage their impact on biodiversity. So when specifically what we're looking into that, policies, how they have a formal statement and stated objectives, actions and results, and KPIs of how they measure progress, which can advise, again, the policy. So looking at biodiversity or water scarcity type of risk assessments, that could be deforestation goals that they have specifically, say, in the supply chain. It could even be, going beyond, if we even talk about regulatory areas, of how they have nature-friendly products and design, or circularity into how they approach things. So it's not just looking from a compliance lens. It's really looking, how do they manage and control risk? Yes, which is more a compliance focus, but also what do they do to go beyond that, to innovate, to make on topics like circularity nature friendly, although circularity is an additional regulation that's coming up as well within Europe for companies to now be paying more attention to.
Now, that's really interesting. When you talk about benchmarking, is that a comparison within the sector, so that you're comparing like with like? It's not, one sector to another.
That's correct. You can compare cross sectors, so it's normalized for materiality across different sectors, because there's a rating, essentially a score out of 100, that takes into account what's material and how well it's being managed. But then you can look, you can certainly see from one sector to another different variations of adoption, let's say on biodiversity, mature levels of maturity and management systems in place. I have, just as an example, just to show how far we yet have to go, according to our data and ratings, only 15% of companies in, let's say, a high-risk extractive industry, so it's a combination of a number of things, mining and metals and so on, have policies on biodiversity in 2023. It's up from 13% the year prior. And just a policy, right? That's a really starting point of having a statement.
Because that's up 2%. And that's in the year after the Global Biodiversity Framework agreed to protect 30% of land and ocean and agreed to actually enforce regulation to make companies comply with it. And they haven't even got policies.
Well, cascading takes time, right? Cascading from governance institutions through to regulation, as we know, takes time to get things passed and moving. Keeping in mind this data set as well, 140,000 companies rated, a segment of those in high-risk extractive industries. We're looking at small to medium-sized companies. Not all of them, but a high percentage of 60 to 70% of them are smaller, and also as well as an emerging market. So back to the point on a tide that raises all boats, it's really important that we bring along the supply chain and the smaller companies on this journey as well.
So what do you actually do to help companies set targets for themselves? Because I'm thinking about, we've got the regulations that are coming. Then there are things like the science-based targets, which are for climate, and there's new ones coming out for biodiversity. We've got the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and that's now coming out with the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. How do companies do what they need to do, and how can you help them do it better or at all?
Yeah. So again, back to the voluntary standard piece, because a lot of this way of working, of thinking about sustainability, doing materiality assessments, action plans behind remediating risk, and then deeper diving into certain areas like climate or biodiversity, have existed for some time. So there's nothing new here. And the regulation, in essence, is based on this. What's new is that it's putting it in a new box of how it needs to be reported to a particular regulatory framework. I've had a lot of companies, the ones more advanced, leading the way. They said, we've been doing this for years, what the regulation is asking of us. It's a bit of a pain because I need to spend my resources to get organized to report on it. But once we standardize that, it will be fine and we'll go back to working on our innovative projects. Companies never exposed to it say, wow, it's totally new and different. And what is this? Where does it come from? So EcoVadis, in that essence, we have, as I mentioned, a foundation on these voluntary frameworks evolving with regulation. So as there might be specific fine-tuning of data points on biodiversity or different metrics to be collected, we're adding those, or fine-tuning exactly to make sure that when a company is reporting to then therefore or disclosing and being rated by EcoVadis, that the outputs on the improvement areas and the data and metrics that come in guide them as well, not to comply entirely, because compliance is a license to operate. That's a part of it, and that's what we're supporting. But the methodology is also reflecting and supporting companies to showcase those that are on the leading edge and might not be under a regulatory framework. So adopting nature-based solutions is not necessarily concretely asked by regulatory bodies. Net zero targets or paying a living wage, for instance. So it's balancing the two of getting foundational data for regulatory purposes, but also enabling companies to showcase that might be going beyond.
And can you talk to me a little bit about nature-based solutions, what you're referring to and what companies can do? Because I really know it best in terms of the carbon markets and, using carbon finance to finance nature-based solutions. So what does it mean in a broader sense?
Yeah, so, it's a concept was coined, again, 20 years ago, getting a bigger on trend and hype, but it refers indeed to a wide range of ecosystem-based approaches aiming to mimic or integrate and therefore preserve natural ecosystems. Two examples from the industries we spoke about. So in agriculture, it could be, you can imagine the opposite of what we see quite commonly, a kind of monocrop approach and, doing that year after year. So it links to doing things like diverse vegetation, rotating cover crops, having native trees, habitats for pollinators. You spoke about bees. So doing this is creating an environment and connection with the ecosystem for better soil fertility, better water retention and availability, also carbon sequestration as well, which indeed that's probably the one most talked about. For construction, it's thinking about buildings and infrastructure. How do you create natural systems for things like stormwater management, right? Concrete, asphalt, like the water doesn't stick and stay and it creates problems. So green roofs or urban forests, these can also link to business benefits like lower heating and cooling costs, the stormwater overflow dimension as well.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So what are you seeing? Obviously, nature-based solutions are becoming increasingly popular, but what are the trends that you're seeing in biodiversity action at a corporate level? I suppose, how do you see companies evolving in the ways in which they address the conservation of biodiversity and nature?
Yeah, so while climate change is a significant driver of biodiversity loss, I think companies are beginning to recognize it's one of many. But climate change having so much, and for the right reason as well, importance and energy and action around it. Almost 70% of the Fortune 500 have made a commitment to whether it's net zero or some type of climate carbon reduction initiative. They're interconnected. So I think there's an opportunity here, and we're seeing that a bit of people making the connections. And therefore, I think advocacy and having a similar level of attention and investment in nature and biodiversity, that can actually help them capitalize by working on biodiversity to support their carbon and decarbonization initiatives. So understanding that, I think, is key and is a trend that we see increasing. There is a lag far behind on biodiversity, as we already spoke of, from the data set that we see. Also, financing is an issue. So there's some barriers to come over here. I think on the financing piece, at the moment, direct private sector financing of nature-based solutions, for example, it's quite minimal because there is a high front cost. The example I gave for agriculture, you have to, plant trees, set up flowers, do cover cropping. There's an additional workload to that. So there's resource to be spent there. So on financing, I think there's a whole society approach. So multi-stakeholder across, looking partnership with high risk sectors. As I mentioned, that's where most of the challenges are. Financial institutions, central banks, and governments. I think this is where it's at.
That's a really interesting point, because one of the things I think that people want to know is what they can do as individuals. And I think when it's a whole society approach, it's not like you can start doing recycling in the office and that's going to make a difference. How would you encourage individuals to advocate and to push for change, to push for a contribution to the preservation of biodiversity?
I think, individuals in business, I think it's about elevating the conversation internally, if and where they can. Sometimes, there's always, you can use a carrot and a stick approach in the conversation, depending on who you're speaking to. Both can meet the need. But I think looking at a bit of the both, there are big risks for business. There's systemic risks, let's say total ecosystem collapse, meaning disruptions in the supply chain, increasing costs, supply chain delays, and so on. There's transition risks. Indeed, for companies, these regulations are increasing. We see a proliferation of regulation. It's not going to go anywhere. So being caught off guard by that, as I said, companies that have been adopting this for a while, they're not totally smooth sailing, but they're a lot more comfortable in addressing them quickly than somebody just getting started. And then, of course, the physical risks of damage to infrastructure operations. So I think educating senior leadership on these concerns of biodiversity and why business should care about this. So both the risks, but also the opportunities there. I think companies that embrace as well biodiversity conservation, again, that's the carrot piece, can position themselves as leader in sustainability. What is that? Why do that? There's ability to attract investors, customers, partners that prioritize responsible business practices. The whole topic of nature-based solutions, I think, is a really exciting one to explore. It's more applied to certain sectors now, but I think it's a really good space to look and see if and how within your organization there's opportunities for that. But overall, that's what one individual can do. I think we all work in different organizations, whether it's a business, a small business, a nonprofit, is to elevate and understand, explain the conversation and explore collectively what can be done and what's material for what you can do as a broader community.
And that's actually really encouraging for me, because I think, as I said, that biodiversity is such a complex area that I think for a lot of people, they don't even know where to start. And it's interesting because you talk about the potential for total system collapse. We have that as a reality in terms of climate tipping points, in terms of ecosystems. But I think it's incredibly hard for people to get their heads around the idea that this is a possibility. And I think a lot of the time people just stick their heads in the sand, because if it's such a big problem, how can we do anything to sort of make it better? I suppose my question to you is, what message would you convey to individuals or businesses about the importance of biodiversity and the urgency of the crisis without scaring them?
Good question. I think the time is now. I think coming back to nature-based solutions, as I said, this is a really exciting one. both for biodiversity loss and for climate change. If done right in the survey, in the reports and research that we did, it can deliver up to 30% of emissions reductions needed to limit our global warming to 1.5 degrees. So just to give a fact around that, there's extraordinary potential in that and the interconnectivity of those two things. I'd also like to interconnect a piece, again, back to the value chain on a topic called living wage. So I know a number of companies that are working more with coffee, cacao, agricultural type activities in their supply chain are working to pay what's called a living wage within their supply chain. Living wage meaning I can pay for education, I have additional money for savings. I don't need to send my kids to work because I have enough money to support my family with food. Why am I mentioning this? Because in addition to being able to finance or support small farmers, for example, in investing in solutions for climate sequestration, for nature-based solutions on biodiversity loss, they also have to have the relative income to be able to invest in doing that. So that's another way of connecting systemic issues of environment to more human rights and social topics as well. So again, I would leave everyone with, don't forget thinking about the system interconnections here. These things don't stand in isolation, including biodiversity from humans.
I think that's a wonderful way of looking at it, this idea that by trying to address one problem that we face as a planet, as a people, we can actually address other problems as well. It's that idea that every intervention makes a difference at every different level, and that can have a cascade effect in a positive way, which is incredibly encouraging. Now, I'm going to ask you my final question, which is, what haven't I asked you about that I should have done?
Well, I think I covered the topic on living wage, which is something I was really keen and hoping to speak about with you today, because I think that's, again, one of the trends, one of the new things we see. It has interconnections with almost all 17 of the United Nations Development Goals, including topics on biodiversity, whether it's healthy water, environment, and so on. So I already had mentioned that one, and it's been such a pleasure to connect with you on this topic, Felicia.
Well, it's been lovely to have you. It's been really interesting to learn more about it. And it's, as I say, it's really encouraging to feel that sense of a growing understanding of the interconnection between clean air, clean water, education, health, good living, because I think these are topics that I think to many people can sometimes feel impersonal, but really when we're talking about it, action on biodiversity, it's personal. It makes a difference to all of us in different ways. And I find that really quite encouraging and quite exciting. So, Nicole, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been a great pleasure to have you on. To our listeners, I hope you learned and enjoyed. And don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll be back soon.